On the 1st of August 1946, in a courtyard in Moscow, a general was hanged. Not shot, hanged. The distinction matters more than it might appear at first glance, and the people who made that decision knew exactly what they were doing when they made it. In Soviet military tradition, execution by firing squad was a soldier's death. A death with a certain dignity embedded in its form. A bullet as befitted an officer. A death that acknowledged the condemned as someone who had once belonged to a category of men who were respected. The rope was something else entirely. The rope was a criminal's death, a public disgrace, a signal sent to the entire country and to the entire world, crafted with deliberate precision. This man did not deserve even the death of an officer. He needed to be destroyed twice. First physically, then historically. His body was burned afterward. There was no grave. There is no grave today. A man who had been on the front page of Pravda, photographed next to the most celebrated generals in the country, received by Stalin personally, praised as one of the heroes who saved Moscow, that man was hanged in a courtyard, his body burned, his ashes scattered into nothing, as if every trace of his existence needed to be unmade. His name was Andrei Andreevich Vlasov. And here is the question we need to ask ourselves at the very start of this investigation, before we say another word about what he did or didn't do. Why him? The Second World War produced thousands of collaborators, tens of thousands of people who, in various ways and for various reasons, cooperated with the German occupiers. Burgomasters of small towns, police officers at checkpoints, translators in camps, officers who crossed to the enemy out of fear or calculation or ideological conviction or simple desperation. There were tens of thousands of them. Some lived out their lives in quiet obscurity. Some were tried and shot. And nobody outside a footnote in a specialized academic paper remembers their names. But Vlasov is remembered. 80 years after that rope in that Moscow courtyard, people still argue about him. Books are still written, documentaries still made, historians still debate, sometimes bitterly, sometimes furiously, unable to arrive at a verdict that satisfies the evidence and the moral weight of the story simultaneously. The arguments grow sharper with each decade, not quieter. Something about this case refuses to close. The reason it refuses to close is the reason we are here today. Because Vlasov was not an ordinary collaborator. Before he became what he became, he was a hero. Not a metaphor, not an exaggeration, not the kind of heroism that gets assigned to people after the fact, when political convenience requires it. A real, documented, contemporarily recognized hero. In the winter of 1941, when German armor stood 40 kilometers from Moscow, and the world was already preparing for the Soviet capital to fall, it was the 20th Army, under the command of Lieutenant General Andrei Vlasov, that stopped the advance at Solnechnogorsk and Volokholamsk. It was his forces that launched the first counterattack. It was his name that Pravda printed in December 41, alongside Zhukov and Rokossovsky, the two most celebrated names in that war. His portrait looked out at Soviet citizens from the front page as a symbol that Moscow could be held, that the enemy could be stopped, that there were men who would stop him. Stalin personally received Vlasov, and in the coordinate system of that time and that place, a personal meeting with Stalin meant almost everything. Now imagine two photographs. The first, December 41. Vlasov in his Soviet greatcoat, upright, certain, with the expression of a man who knows what he is doing and why. Behind him, the winter landscape of the Moscow region, the snow, the forests, and somewhere beyond the horizon, the retreating German columns. He has just accomplished what many considered impossible. The second, spring 45, the same man, almost unrecognizable, a crumpled German uniform with Russian insignia. The uniform of the ROA, the Russian Liberation Army he created in service to Hitler. His face is haggard. His eyes carry the look of a person who already understands that everything is finished and that there is no path back. The third path he believed in, or convinced himself to believe in, does not exist. Between those two photographs, 3 years and 4 months. That interval is one of the most disturbing, most morally complex, most historically significant episodes of the entire Second World War. Not for what it tells us about Vlasov in particular, but for what it tells us about human beings in general, about war, about systems that break the people who serve them, about the distance between what a person is and what a person becomes when impossibility becomes the only available condition. This investigation makes you a promise at the outset, and it is a promise of discomfort rather than resolution. If you came for a simple verdict, traitor, full stop, case closed, you will not find it here. If you came for rehabilitation, for a narrative that transforms his choices into something noble or excusable, that will not be here either. What you will find is something harder than either of those things. The complete picture, the documents, the facts, the testimonies, and the questions those facts force us to ask. About loyalty and its limits, about what a system owes the people who serve it, about the line between betrayal and despair, and whether that line can always be drawn as clearly as we might prefer. Because the story of Vlasov is not simply the story of one general. It is the story of what an impossible choice does to a human being. It is the story of how a system that demands absolute loyalty can simultaneously make absolute loyalty impossible. It is the story of why the Soviet state feared this man so much after his death that it classified the transcripts of his interrogations for decades, not because those transcripts contained only the confession of a traitor, but because they contained something far more dangerous. An indictment, not against Vlasov, against the system itself. And that is where we begin. Svireri s planem перед написанием. Part 2 по плану. The origin. The 13th child, the seminary that collapsed, and the man who lived inside. Any system. Village of Lomakino, Nizhny Novgorod province, 1901. 13th child of a peasant family. In a family of 13 children, every piece of bread is counted, every pair of boots inherited, eldest to youngest. Youngest learns from birth that resources are limited and survival belongs to whoever is smarter, more persistent, more patient. Father saw ability in the boy, read quickly, calculated well, memorized on first hearing. Decision, seminary in Nizhny Novgorod as the only available social elevator. A priest in early 20th century Russia, education, position, community respect, the way out of the village. Vlasov entered the seminary, studied well. Key characteristic often overlooked, not a brilliant genius, not a prodigy, but a man with a solid, systematic mind, able to learn, able to listen, able to draw conclusions. This quality, systematicness, methodicalness, ability to work within any structure and make it better, would define his entire career and ultimately play a role in his destruction. Seminary never finished. 1917 destroyed the world in which the seminary made sense. 1918, mobilized into the Red Army at 17, no formal choice. But Vlasov did not resist, did not evade, did not hide, went to serve with the same methodical diligence with which he had studied in the seminary, as if simply exchanging one structure for another. The defining pattern, Vlasov was a man of systems, any system, knew how to fit in, how to work within rules, how to please superiors not through flattery but through results, real, measurable results. His units always better trained, better supplied, better commanded than neighboring ones. Rise through 1920s and 1930s. Dark chapter. participating in suppressing peasant uprisings during collectivization, executed the system's orders, even when those orders meant violence against peasants, the same people he had come from. First of many moral compromises. 1937, purges. Army lost thousands of officers. Vlasov survived, not by informing on colleagues, no direct evidence, but by keeping his head down, not standing out, not giving cause. A systematic man in an unsystematic time. After repressions created enormous gaps in the command structure, officers who survived received rapid promotions. The 89th Rifle Division under his command, recognized as best in Kiev military district. Narcoman Timoshenko personally noted it. 1941, sent to China as military advisor to Chiang Kai-shek. Important posting, different military culture, different political reality, possibly planted first seeds of doubt about the absolute rightness of the system he served. Всё месте, пишу. Part 2. The 13th Child. To understand how a man ends up at the end of a rope, you have to begin where every honest account of a human life must begin. Not at the moment of his worst decision, not at the peak of his greatest achievement. At the beginning, in the place that made him, in the conditions that shaped the person he would spend the rest of his life being. The village of Lomokino, Nizhny Novgorod province, 1901. If you want to understand a person, start with where they were born. Lomokino was not a city, not a town, not even a large village. It was a small settlement in central Russia where life was measured by harvests and church holidays and the nearest forest, where children were born and died in the same cottages, where the main event of the year was Easter and the main horizon was the tree line, where few people ever travelled beyond the district and fewer still imagined a life that looked different from the life of everyone around them. Andrei Vlasov was the 13th child in the family of peasant Andrei Grigorievich Vlasov. The 13th. That number is not simply a fact, it is an entire world. In a family where 13 children share a table, every piece of bread is counted. Every pair of boots is passed down from the oldest to the youngest in an unbroken chain of inheritance. The youngest child learns something from birth that luckier children never have to learn. That resources are finite, that you have to fight for your place, that survival belongs to whoever is smarter, more persistent, more patient. Not to whoever arrived first, not to whoever is biggest, but to whoever has figured out how to earn it. The father looked at his youngest son and saw something. The boy read quickly. He calculated well. He memorized on the first hearing without needing to be told again. In a village where these qualities were unusual enough to be noticed, they were noticed. The father made a decision. The seminary in Nizhny Novgorod. In early 20th century Russia, this was the only social elevator that a peasant family could actually reach. A priest was a man with education, a man with a defined position and genuine community respect, a man who had left the closed circle of peasant existence and arrived somewhere that could not be taken from him by a bad harvest or a change of season. It was the way out of Lomokino, the way out of poverty, the way toward a life with a shape that the family could be proud of. Vlasov entered the seminary and studied well. Here is a detail that biographers often pass over too quickly, and it is worth stopping on because it explains everything that followed. He was not a brilliant genius, not a prodigy who dazzled his teachers with sudden flashes of extraordinary insight. What he was, and what he was consistently and reliably from the moment anyone started paying attention to him, was a man with a solid, systematic mind. He could learn. He could listen. He could draw conclusions from what he had heard and remember those conclusions and apply them the next time a similar situation arose. He was methodical. He was thorough. He was the kind of student who does not necessarily understand something faster than his classmates, but understands it more completely once he does, and does not forget it. That quality, systematicness, methodicalness, the deep capacity to work within any given structure and make that structure function more efficiently than it did before he arrived, would define every stage of his career that followed. It would be the reason for his promotions. It would be the reason commanders noticed him and superiors praised him, and eventually Stalin himself received him in the Kremlin. And it would be, in a way that becomes clear only when you see the whole arc of the story, one of the things that ultimately contributed to his destruction. But the seminary was never finished, because in 1917, the entire world in which the seminary made sense collapsed. Revolution arrived in Lomachyno the way it arrived everywhere. First as rumors, then as decrees, then as real people with weapons who explained that the old order was finished. The church was separated from the state. The spiritual career that the father had planned for his youngest son dissolved in months. In 1918, Vlasov was mobilized into the Red Army. He was 17 years old. No formal choice was offered. Civil war was underway. Young men were taken regardless of their wishes. But here is the thing worth paying attention to. Vlasov did not resist. He did not evade, did not hide, did not find a reason to disappear until the mobilization moved on. He went to serve, and he went with the same methodical diligence with which he had studied in the seminary, as if he had simply exchanged one institution for another, and was now applying himself to learning its rules and requirements, with exactly the same focused attention he had brought to his previous enrollment. One structure had collapsed, another had appeared. He entered the new one and began to learn how it worked. This pattern, finding the structure, learning its requirements, making himself useful within it, producing results that could be measured and recognized, would repeat throughout his entire life. It is neither a criticism nor a defense of him. It is simply a description of who he was. Vlasov was a man of systems, any system. He knew how to fit in, how to work within a given set of rules, how to please the people above him, not through empty flattery or visible ambition, but through the one currency that is hardest to fake: actual results. The units he commanded were consistently better trained, better supplied, and better organized than the neighboring units. This was noticed by commanders, and the career moved upward. Through the 1920s and 30s, methodically and steadily, the peasant boy from Lomachyno rose through a structure that had displaced the one his father had chosen for him, but that rewarded exactly the same qualities the seminary would have rewarded. There is a dark passage in these years that his biographers often mention briefly and move past. During collectivization, Vlasov participated in the suppression of peasant uprisings. He executed the orders of the system, even when those orders meant violence directed at people who were, in every material sense, exactly the same as the people who had raised him. This was the first of several moral compromises he made in the name of the structure he had entered and chosen to serve. He made it without visible hesitation. Whether it cost him something inwardly is something we cannot know. What we know is that he made it. In 1937, the Great Purge arrived, and the Soviet army lost thousands of its best officers in months. Marshal Tukhachevsky and the senior command structure were destroyed. Any officer with connections to those who had been arrested was at risk. Vlasov survived. Not, as far as any documentary evidence shows, by informing on colleagues. Not by some particularly cunning maneuvering, but by doing what he had always done. Staying within the structure, not standing out in the wrong direction, not giving cause. A systematic man in the most unsystematic period the Soviet military had ever experienced. When the purges were over, the gaps they had left in the command structure were enormous. Officers who had survived received rapid promotions simply because the positions above them were empty. Vlasov's 89th Rifle Division was recognized as the finest in the Kiev military district. Narkom Timoshenko noted it personally during a review. In 1941, he was sent to China as a military advisor to the forces of Chiang Kai-shek. It was an important posting. He observed a different military culture, a different political reality, an army organized around an idea that was not the Soviet idea. He saw how military force could be structured and motivated in ways his own training had not described. Whether this planted seeds of doubt about the absolute rightness of the system he served is reconstruction rather than documented fact. But the seeds of doubt, wherever they came from, were already present by the time he returned. By the time the summer of 1941 arrived and the world changed again, faster and more completely than anyone had predicted. The 22nd of June, 1941, arrived the way catastrophic events often arrive. Suddenly, completely, and in a form that made everything that had seemed solid prove to be far more fragile than anyone had been willing to admit. The German offensive shattered the Soviet Western defenses with a speed that had no precedent in the experience of any commander on either side. Within days, within weeks, the scale of what was happening exceeded anything that the military planning documents had described as possible. Encirclements swallowed entire armies. Units that had existed on paper as organized fighting forces ceased to exist in reality within hours of contact. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers were taken prisoner in pockets that closed faster than any rescue or withdrawal could be organized. Generals who had spent their careers preparing for war found themselves facing a reality that the training had not covered, because the training had assumed certain minimums of coherence that the first weeks of the war destroyed completely. Many of those generals lost themselves in the collapse. This is not a judgment. It is a description of what happens to command structures when the foundational assumptions of those structures prove false simultaneously across the entire front. Men who had been competent officers in a functioning system found that their competence had been a property of the system rather than of themselves, and when the system failed, they failed with it. Vlasov did not fail. In the chaos of the summer of 1941, when the standard outcome for Soviet formations in the west of the country was encirclement followed by dissolution, his 37th Mechanized Corps fought in encirclement near Lvov and managed to break out. This was not a small achievement. This was, in the context of that particular summer, an exceptional one. Most encircled units in those weeks simply ceased to exist as military formations. They disintegrated under pressure, surrendered in mass, scattered into the forests and the fields. The 37th Corps fought its way through and emerged on the other side as a functioning unit. The systematic man had proved that his systematicness was not borrowed from the institution around him. It was his own. The retreats continued through the autumn. The situation remained desperate across the entire front. But Vlasov's reputation was beginning to take a shape that separated him from the general catastrophe surrounding him. He held positions that others abandoned. He organized withdrawals that preserved fighting capability instead of leaving wreckage. His command style, demanding results, insisting on preparation and supply and training, rather than on raw aggression that consumed men without return, produced the measurable outcomes that had always defined his career. People noticed, and in wartime, the people who noticed were the people who could direct resources and assignments toward men who had proved what they could do. Then came December. German armor stood approximately 40 kilometers from Moscow. Every serious military analyst who examined the maps and the force strengths and the supply lines in those weeks arrived at the same conclusion. The Soviet capital was likely to fall. The Western governments were preparing contingency plans. The diplomatic corps was partially evacuated. Within the Soviet leadership, there were people who privately considered the worst-case outcome and tried to calculate what came after it. The psychological weight of that moment, the sense that everything the revolution had built was balanced on an edge above which the outcome was still undecided, cannot be overstated. The 20th Army, under the command of Lieutenant General Andrei Vlasov, occupied positions on the northwest defensive line, the sector running through Solnechnogorsk, Volokholamsk, and Istra. This was not a secondary sector. This was the critical sector. If the Germans penetrated here, the approach to Moscow was open. There was no prepared second line that could absorb the breakthrough. The 20th Army was what stood between the German advance and the city, and the 20th Army held. On the 5th of December 1941, Soviet forces launched their counter-offensive. The 20th Army attacked in conditions that the word difficult does not adequately describe. Temperatures that disabled machinery, snow that made movement across open ground a physical ordeal measured in hours rather than kilometers. Limited ammunition, limited fuel, limited reinforcement against an enemy whose own supply lines were extended and whose confidence in eventual victory had survived everything the autumn had thrown against it. Vlasov's forces attacked anyway, and they attacked in the manner that characterized everything he commanded, with preparation, with coordination, with an understanding of what was achievable and what was not, with demands on his officers that were precise rather than theatrical. Solnechnogorsk was liberated. Then Volokholamsk. The German formations that had stood 40 kilometers from Moscow began to move backward. For the first time in the entire war, that backward movement felt different. In the previous months, there had been tactical withdrawals, deliberate repositioning, retreats explained by headquarters communiques as part of a larger operational design. This was something else. The Germans were going backward because they were being pushed, because the force pressing against them was stronger at these specific points than the force resisting it, and because the Soviet commander opposite them had organized that pressure effectively enough to make it count. Pravda ran his photograph, not in a small box in an interior page, on the front page in a grouping of 3 portraits under a headline about the defense of Moscow. The other 2 photographs showed Zhukov and Rokossovsky, the 2 names that had already become, in the consciousness of every Soviet citizen who read newspapers, the symbols of the resistance that was keeping the country alive. 3 faces on one page, presented with equal visual weight, and the message was unmistakable. Here are the men who saved the capital. Stalin summoned him. In the system that existed in Moscow in December of 1941, this meant something very specific and very significant. A personal meeting with Stalin was not a routine administrative event. It was a designation. It said, in terms that every person in the command structure understood without needing it explained, that this individual had been separated from the mass of commanders and placed in a different category, one that included both exceptional prospects and exceptional personal protection. It meant that eyes were on you. It meant that your future, whatever it held, would be shaped by that attention. Vlasov walked into the Kremlin and walked out as a lieutenant general with combat decorations and a reputation that had been authenticated at the highest possible level in the Soviet system. He was 40 years old. He had traveled the distance from a peasant household in Lomakino, from the 13th child learning to read in a village that appeared on no important map, to a man whose portrait appeared on the front page of the state newspaper, alongside the most famous military figures in the country, to a general personally received and acknowledged by Stalin himself. It looked, from outside, and perhaps from inside as well, like the summit. Everything that followed should have been a continuation of the upward line. More commands, more responsibility, more recognition, the continued ascent of a career that had been built on one consistent and demonstrable quality: the ability to make systems work better than they had worked before. But precisely at this moment, at the exact peak, at the point where the trajectory appeared most clearly established, the system he had served with that unwavering, methodical loyalty for 20 years began preparing something that was not the continuation of the upward line. It was not directed at him personally, that is important to say clearly and without softening it. The trap that was being assembled was not constructed out of malice toward Vlasov as an individual. It was not a conspiracy against a specific man. It was something in certain ways more frightening than a conspiracy. It was simply how the system operated. It set tasks that could not be completed with the resources it was willing to provide. It demanded victories from commanders it was unwilling to supply. It forbade retreat when retreat was the only action that could preserve the lives of the men in the field. And it did not forgive the commanders who ended up in the wrong position at the moment when the system's own failures became undeniable. The wrong position had a name, the Volkhov front. The wrong moment was the spring and summer of 1942. And when those two coordinates intersected, everything that had been built, the career, the reputation, the portrait on the front page of Pravda, the meeting in the Kremlin, would begin its movement toward a rope in a Moscow courtyard 4 years later. The Volkhov swamps of Leningrad Oblast in the winter and spring of 1942 were one of those places. The endless bogs of the region became a grave for tens of thousands of Soviet soldiers, not primarily from German attacks, not from the mechanized firepower that had defined the catastrophe of the summer before. They died from hunger, from cold, from diseases that the 19th century had already learned to prevent, and from something more abstract but no less lethal, the complete, absolute, systemic indifference of the command structure to the fate of the people it had sent into those swamps, and then decided it was more convenient not to bring back out. To understand how Vlasov arrived in those swamps, and what the swamps did to him, it is necessary to understand how the operation that created them came into existence. In January of 1942, on the wave of the successful defense of Moscow, the Soviet High Command made a decision that carried the particular character of decisions made by people who have just experienced a significant success and have drawn the wrong conclusions from it. Stalin was convinced that the German retreat at Moscow indicated imminent general collapse, that the Wehrmacht was broken, demoralized, ready to shatter if pressed on multiple fronts simultaneously. Experienced commanders, Zhukov among them, pushed back. The army was exhausted. The supply lines were stretched. The forces available were insufficient for the scope of the offensive the plan described. The correct approach was to consolidate the gains that had been made and prepare for the spring. Stalin did not listen. One of the ambitious operations that followed was the Lubyan offensive. Its objective was logical and humane in its purpose: to break the Leningrad blockade by striking from the south through the Volkhov front, pushing through the German lines and linking up with the forces besieged in the city. If it succeeded, hundreds of thousands of people would be saved. The intent was sound. Between the intent and the reality lay a distance measured in swamps and forests and German fortifications that had been built with the methodical thoroughness that characterized German defensive engineering. The Second Shock Army launched its attack in January 42, before Vlasov arrived. It broke through the German front and drove forward, an initial success that became a trap within weeks of its occurrence. As the army pushed deeper, the narrow corridor through which its supply moved became a target for German pressure from both flanks. The corridor narrowed. The supply that had been promised and that the operation depended on arrived intermittently, then rarely, then in quantities that bore no relationship to what 60,000 people required to remain functional as a fighting force. The reinforcements that had been scheduled did not materialize. The army pushed forward into territory it could not hold and could not supply, and began to understand, slowly at first and then with increasing certainty, that no one was coming. In April of 1942, with the army already trapped, already running short of food, already fighting the additional enemy of the swamp itself, Vlasov was appointed its commander. This decision deserves to be named for what it was. It was not malicious in its intent toward Vlasov specifically. There is no evidence that anyone in the Stavka thought, "We will send Vlasov to this impossible situation so that he suffers for it. The cruelty was impersonal, which in certain ways makes it worse. Changing the commander of a trapped and starving army does not unstrap the army or feed it. An army in that condition could be saved by exactly one action: an immediate order to withdraw behind the front line, accepting the operational failure and preserving the fighting force for future use. That order was not given. Instead, a new commander was appointed and the army was told to hold on. Vlasov arrived and saw what was there to see. Try to picture the specific reality of April in the Volkhov swamps. It is not spring in any sense that the word normally conveys. The snow is melting, and what the melting snow produces in that terrain is not the beginning of warmth and growth, but the conversion of already impassable bog into something still worse, an unbroken expanse of ice-cold water and mud that makes movement in any direction a separate ordeal calculated in exhaustion rather than distance. Men stood knee-deep in that water. They could not advance because the terrain and the German positions combined to make advance impossible. They could not retreat because the order prohibiting retreat had not been changed by the change of commander. They stood in the water and waited. The soldiers ate tree bark. This is not a literary device, not the kind of figurative language that historical writing sometimes employs to evoke conditions without specifying them precisely. It is a documented fact, confirmed in multiple sources. Bark from the trees in the forest around them, leather belts, the soles of their boots when the leather could be made soft enough to chew. Scurvy appeared in the army, the disease caused by prolonged absence of vitamins, the disease that ocean sailors had suffered in the age of sail before anyone understood nutrition, the disease that modern medicine had rendered essentially theoretical. It was no longer theoretical in the Volkhov swamps in the spring of 1942. Vlasov wrote reports to the Stavka with the same methodical detail that had characterized his communications throughout his career. The reports contain numbers. So many men killed in the last period, so many sick and unable to fight, so many days of rations remaining at current consumption rates, so many rounds per weapon available. He was not asking for the impossible. He was asking for the minimum: permission to withdraw the army to positions from which it could be supplied and where it could function as a military force, or, alternatively, the actual delivery of the supply that had been promised and on which the army's continued existence depended. The Stavka responded. The Stavka promised that help was coming. The Stavka said, "Hold on. Reinforcements are being organized. Supply aircraft are being arranged. The situation will improve." The reinforcements did not come. The supply was never organized in any form that reached the army in meaningful quantities. The improvement did not happen. In May, the Germans closed the ring. The army was in full encirclement. No corridor, no resupply route, no path out except through German positions that the army no longer had the strength or ammunition to breach. Vlasov was offered evacuation by aircraft, the standard Soviet protocol for extracting a trapped army commander so that he could be used elsewhere. He refused. Why he refused is a question that historians have examined from multiple angles and arrived at different conclusions about. The simplest interpretation: he could not bring himself to leave 60,000 men to die while he flew to safety. This reads as a form of honor. There is a second interpretation that is less flattering and possibly more accurate. He knew that returning behind the front lines without his army meant a tribunal at minimum, and he was calculating that staying gave him some possibility, however diminishing, of finding another outcome. Both of these things may have been true at the same time. Human motivation is rarely composed of a single element. June. The encircled units began attempting to break out in small groups, different groups moving in different directions, through the swamp and through the German blocking positions, hoping that some combination of timing and terrain and determination would open a gap. Some succeeded, most did not. The 12th of July, 1942. A barn in the village of Turkoveji. A man found inside, exhausted, in peasant clothes. The exact circumstances of how he came to be found there, whether he emerged voluntarily, whether he was discovered, whether local residents handed him to the Germans, or whether a German patrol stumbled across him, are disputed between different sources and remain unresolved. What is not disputed is the condition of the man found there. He was broken. Not only in the physical sense that 3 months of moving through swamps and forests on inadequate food would produce. Broken in the other sense too. In 3 months he had lost an army. He had watched 60,000 people die in conditions that he had documented in detail, in numbered reports, in requests that had gone answered with promises and unanswered in practice. Those people had not died because they fought badly, or because they lacked courage, or because the operational situation was too complex for any command to manage. They had died because the system that sent them there decided, at each specific moment when their survival required a decision, that making that decision was less important than preserving the appearance that everything was under control. He had survived. They had not. What happens to a person in that position? What happens to a general who is alive when his army is dead, who carries inside him the knowledge that the army did not have to die, that the deaths were not inevitable, but were produced by a series of decisions and refusals to decide, that he witnessed in real time and documented and protested and was unable to change? This is not a question asked in order to justify what followed. It is asked in order to understand it. And understanding and justifying are not the same thing. They are categorically different things, and collapsing that distinction is one of the ways that honest historical examination gets replaced by something simpler but less true. What followed was a choice, an impossible choice, made by a broken man in impossible circumstances, but a choice nonetheless. And choices have consequences that the circumstances that produce them do not fully explain and do not fully excuse. Those consequences were what the Germans were about to offer him. Svirаю s planem перед написанием. Part 5, Paplanel, the choice, the German uniform, the third path that did not exist, and Karbyshev in the mirror, the Vinitsa camp for high-ranking Soviet POWs. When Germans discovered who they had, something resembling quiet commotion ran through German command. Immense propaganda value. If the general who defended Moscow joined the German side, it meant the Soviet system was so rotten that even its heroes were fleeing. Germans began working with Vlasov carefully and professionally. Good food, normal conditions, polite interlocutors, no obvious pressure, just conversations, just questions. Vlasov spoke, voluntarily, not under torture, not from fear. Methodically, just as he had always written his reports, with names, dates, figures, about the war, about the system, about how his army had died. 3 interpretations examined with deliberate fairness. Cowardice/fear doesn't hold up. Not threatened with death when captured, Germans understood his value. He had a real alternative, simply stay silent, as Karbyshev did. Cowardice doesn't explain active, voluntary collaboration. Genuine ideological transformation contains significant truth. His words sounded like personal pain, not scripted propaganda, but incomplete. Ideological transformation doesn't explain the German uniform. You can stop believing in Stalin without wearing the uniform of his enemy. The third path, self-deception, most likely closest to truth, convinced himself he was using Germans as instrument, creating an independent Russian military force that after defeating Stalin would become foundation for a new, free Russia. This was an illusion. Hitler considered Slavs a lower race, not partners. Absolutely incompatible with Nazi ideology. The Karbyshev parallel. General Karbyshev captured roughly simultaneously, similar conditions. Germans worked with him 3 years. Offers, persuasions, privileges, threats. He refused always. February 1945 at Mauthausen. Guards poured cold water on him in freezing temperatures. Died. 2 generals, 1 war, same choice, different answers. Karbyshev, hero of the Soviet Union, posthumously. The uncomfortable question: did Vlasov have the same choice as Karbyshev? Formally, yes. Actually, not quite. Karbyshev arrived captured, wounded, and unconscious. Without an army behind him, without 60,000 dead soldiers he had been unable to save. Vlasov arrived broken by a system that had already betrayed him and which he knew had already betrayed him. Doesn't make his choice right, but makes it human in the darkest sense. Gradual progression of collaboration. One conversation, then another, then a leaflet over Soviet positions, then the Smolensk Declaration of December 1942, then the German uniform. Each step made the next slightly easier because the worst step was already behind. Всё на месте. Пишу. Part 5. The Mirror. There is a moment in the life of every person who makes a catastrophic choice when they are not yet making it, when they are simply having a conversation, when they are answering questions put to them in a reasonable tone by someone who seems genuinely interested in what they have to say, when nothing has been decided yet and every road still seems technically available, and the choice that will define everything is still just a conversation, just words, just the sound of one person speaking to another in a room. That moment for Vlasov lasted several months. The camp at Vinnytsia, where the Germans brought him, was not an ordinary prisoner of war facility. The ordinary POW facility for Soviet soldiers in 1942 was a place where people died in enormous numbers, from deliberate starvation, from exposure, from disease, in conditions that historians classify without hesitation as crimes against humanity. The facility at Vinnytsia was something different. It was a specialized institution designed for a specialized purpose: the careful, patient, professional handling of senior Soviet officers whose knowledge and whose names had value that went beyond anything their physical presence could threaten. When the Germans understood who was sitting in that barn in peasant clothes, something moved through their command structure that had the character, if not quite the volume, of astonishment. Vlasov. The man from the front page of Pravda, the general personally received by Stalin, the face that Soviet citizens had been shown as one of the men who had saved Moscow. The propaganda value of this specific human being was difficult to overstate. If the general who had defended Moscow, the man the Soviet state had publicly held up as a symbol of resistance, had crossed to the German side, had crossed voluntarily, had crossed with reasons he was willing to articulate, the damage to Soviet morale would be of a different order than anything a military defeat could produce. A military defeat kills soldiers and loses territory. This would kill something harder to rebuild: the story a country tells itself about who its best people are and what they stand for. The Germans began working with Vlasov carefully, professionally, with the patience of people who understood that this was not a situation to rush. Good food, normal living conditions, polite interlocutors who had read his file and knew what questions to ask. No obvious pressure, no threats, no coercion that could be pointed to later as the explanation for what happened. Just conversations, just attentive people in a room who were genuinely interested in what he had to say. And Vlasov spoke. This is the point at which this story requires the most careful and most honest examination, because it is the point at which the simple version, the traitor who betrayed his country, and the sympathetic version, the broken man who was manipulated, both break down and leave us with something more complicated. He spoke voluntarily. This needs to be stated clearly because it is true and because the temptation to avoid it is strong. He was not under torture. He was not threatened with execution. He was not starving or cold or in any physical condition that would explain the choice as simple survival behavior. He had, as will become clear in a moment, a completely real alternative. He chose not to take it. He spoke with the same methodical quality that had characterized everything he had ever done, with names, with dates, with figures, with the logical sequence of a man building an argument rather than answering an interrogation. He spoke about the war, about the Stavka, about his army in the swamps, and the reports he had written, and the promises that had come back, and the help that never came. The words came out of him in the organized way that all his words had always come out, and they revealed not just facts about the Soviet military command, but the personal experience of a man who had watched 60,000 people die because the system had decided something other than their survival was more important. Historians have proposed 3 explanations for why he spoke, and all 3 deserve examination without the predetermined outcome that usually shapes this part of the story. The first, he was afraid. He feared death, feared the conditions of an ordinary POW camp, and chose collaboration to preserve himself. This explanation has the advantage of simplicity. It has the disadvantage of being inadequate to the facts. At the moment of his capture, nobody was threatening Vlasov with death. The Germans understood his value and were treating him accordingly. And more importantly, he had a completely real alternative. He could have simply stayed silent. The man who proves this is General Lieutenant Dmitry Karbyshev. Karbyshev fell into German captivity in August 41. Roughly the same period, roughly similar conditions. He was captured, wounded and unconscious, so his captivity began before he had any choice in the matter. What he chose, consistently, from that point until the last day of his life, was refusal. The Germans worked with him for 3 years. 3 years of offers, of reasonable conversations, of presented alternatives, of conditions improved and then threatened and then changed. He refused every approach with the same answer. I am a Soviet officer and I will remain one. They did not shoot him for refusing. They tried harder to persuade him. They tried for 3 years. In February of 1945, at the concentration camp of Mauthausen, the guards took Karbyshev outside in temperatures far below freezing and poured cold water over him until he died. 2 generals, 1 war, the same choice placed in front of both of them. Different answers. Karbyshev was posthumously designated a hero of the Soviet Union. Schools carry his name. Streets carry his name. His decision is honored with the full weight of state recognition as the right decision, the only acceptable decision, the decision that every Soviet officer should have made. Vlasov was hanged and his body burned. But there is a question embedded in this comparison that is genuinely uncomfortable to ask and genuinely necessary to ask. Did Vlasov have the same choice as Karbyshev? Formally, yes. Actually, not entirely. Karbyshev arrived in captivity, wounded and unconscious. There was no army behind him that had died while he remained alive. There were no 60,000 men whose deaths he had documented in numbered reports, whose appeals for help had been answered with promises that did not materialize, whose survival had been within reach if the system had made different decisions. Karbyshev arrived at his moment of choice carrying one man's history. Vlasov arrived at his, carrying the weight of a catastrophe whose causes he understood in specific detail. None of this makes his choice right. That needs to be said equally clearly. The fact that the system had already failed him did not obligate him to put on the uniform of the system's enemy. Thousands of officers had been failed by the same system in comparable or worse ways and had not done what Vlasov did. The personal history of his betrayal by the institution he served did not constitute a permission to betray it in return. What it constituted was an explanation, not the kind of explanation that excuses an outcome, but the kind that makes it human rather than simply monstrous. The progression happened gradually, which is how these things always happen. One conversation, then a second conversation, then an agreement to write a short text, just an explanation of his own position, not a declaration, just words. Then a leaflet, dropped over Soviet positions, telling soldiers they had been betrayed and that there was another path available. Then the Smolensk Declaration of December 42, signed with his name, calling on Soviet citizens to fight against Stalin in cooperation with Germany. Then the German uniform. Each step was smaller than the one before it. Each step was the logical extension of the previous one, and each step made the next slightly easier, because the worst step, the one that could not be undone, was always the one that had just been taken. By the time he understood, with whatever clarity remained available to him, that he had crossed a line he had told himself was still ahead of him, the line had been behind him for some time. He had convinced himself, and this is the third explanation for his choice, the one that the evidence most consistently supports, that he was not betraying Russia, but using Germany, that he was building something, an independent Russian military force that, after the defeat of Stalin, would become the foundation for a Russia without the purges, without the collectivization, without the system that had sent his army to die in swamps while promising that help was coming. Not a Nazi puppet, a genuine Russian actor, capable of negotiating with a victorious Germany as a partner rather than a subject. This was an illusion, not a small one, a grandiose one, almost tragic in the scale of its naivety, or its cynicism, or its self-deception, depending on which interpretation you choose to credit and in what proportion. Hitler's views on Slavic peoples were not ambiguous or subject to revision based on clever negotiation. The idea of an independent Russian partner was not compatible with Nazi ideology and was never going to be. Vlasov either did not understand this, which requires a certain suspension of disbelief, or understood it and convinced himself that circumstances would change. Circumstances, as he was about to discover over 3 years of wearing a German uniform, did not change. For 3 years, from the end of 1942 through most of 1944, Vlasov traveled from POW camp to POW camp across occupied Soviet territory. He gave speeches, he made promises, he described the Russia that could exist after Stalin was removed, a country without the purges, without collectivization, without the machinery of terror that had been the background of Soviet life for a generation. People in those camps listened. Some believed him. Many enrolled in the ROA, not because they were convinced by the vision, but because the alternative, remaining in the ordinary camp system, where Soviet prisoners were dying in their hundreds of thousands, was itself a sentence that the word difficult does not adequately convey. But here was the fundamental, irreducible absurdity at the center of everything Vlasov was doing. The army he was building did not exist. Hitler's views on Slavic peoples were not a negotiating position. They were a conviction, consistently held and consistently expressed, that what he called the Eastern peoples were destined for labor and exploitation rather than partnership. The concept of an independent Russian military force operating under Russian command with Russian political objectives was not simply something he opposed. It was something he considered nonsensical. The men who enrolled in the ROA were distributed through German auxiliary formations under German officers, used at secondary positions and rear security operations, employed wherever German forces needed a body to fill a gap. They were not under Vlasov's command. They did not advance Vlasov's political program. They served German military needs and no other purpose. Vlasov was a general with a title and no army. He was driven from camp to camp as a living propaganda instrument, a face attached to a message the Germans found useful and would discard the moment it ceased to be useful. In November of 1944, Himmler finally granted what Vlasov had been requesting for more than 2 years: permission to form real divisions of the ROA under genuine Russian command. 2 divisions, with the possibility of more. Real artillery, real organizational structure, Russian officers at every level of command. Vlasov received what he had asked for in November of 1944, with less than 6 months remaining in the war. If this story were fiction, this moment would be the point at which the author is accused of overworking the irony. 3 years of asking for an army, 3 years of being used as a poster while the actual military force was denied, and when the army was finally authorized, finally actually formally given, what remained to be done with it was the question of how to arrange the most dignified possible form of catastrophe. The 1st ROA Division, under its commander, Bunyachenko, engaged Soviet forces on the Oder in February of 45. The action ended in withdrawal and significant losses. After this, Bunyachenko made a decision that had no precedent in the history of this already unprecedentedly strange formation. He stopped obeying German orders. He moved the division south, toward Czechoslovakia, toward what he and Vlasov had apparently calculated was the only remaining possibility, reaching American positions before Soviet forces arrived. What happened next in Prague on the first days of May 1945 cannot be fully explained by any logic that had governed any previous part of this story. The Czech population of the city rose in armed uprising against the German occupation. The German garrison moved to suppress the uprising. The Czech insurgents appealed by radio to any Allied forces within range. The Americans were nearby, but had agreed to stop at a line. The Soviets were advancing, but had not yet arrived. Into this gap, in one of the strangest military interventions of the entire war, the 1st ROA Division turned against the Germans and attacked the garrison in support of the Czech uprising. For several days, Vlasov's soldiers, men who had spent 3 years fighting on the German side, men in German pattern uniforms with Russian insignia, fought in Prague against the Germans. Czech citizens met them in the streets with flowers. They embraced the soldiers, called them liberators, wept with relief. They did not know, or chose in that moment not to consider, who exactly was walking through their city and where those men had come from. Vlasov himself watched from outside the city. He was already thinking about the Americans, about the Yalta agreements signed by Roosevelt, Churchill and Stalin in February of that year, about whether those agreements might somehow be navigated, whether the American government, already viewing Soviet post-war behavior with increasing concern, might decide that preserving a Russian anti-Soviet military force served their interests better than honoring a commitment to an ally. The Americans honored the commitment. The Yalta agreements required the repatriation of all Soviet citizens found on Allied territory, without exceptions, without right of asylum. American forces complied. On the 12th of May 1945, Vlasov was arrested. By some accounts, Soviet officers stopped a column of American vehicles and physically removed him. By other accounts, he was handed over in the ordinary course of the repatriation process. He did not resist. He stepped out of the vehicle when the moment came and did not resist. He arrived at Lubyanka in May of 45 and remained there for 14 months. In the interrogation rooms of Smersh, Soviet military counterintelligence, the organization whose name translated as death to spies, Vlasov spoke with the same quality of methodical thoroughness that had characterized every communication of his life. He spoke voluntarily. He was not tortured into his testimony. He named names, specific generals and marshals who had signed the orders that kept his army in the swamps after it was clear the army could not survive there. He gave dates, specific moments when the Stavka had been informed of the situation and had chosen not to act on that information. He provided figures, how many men had been lost after each refusal, how many requests had gone unanswered, how many days of food had been available at each point in the deterioration. The protocols of his interrogations read less like the confession of a man guilty of betrayal than like the systematic account of a man documenting the crimes of the institution that had destroyed him. This is why those protocols were classified immediately and completely, sealed away for decades under access restrictions that outlasted the Soviet Union itself. They were not classified because they contained state secrets about current military capabilities. They were classified because they contained an indictment, not against Vlasov, against the system. And that was a document no Soviet state could allow to circulate. The trial lasted 2 days, 2 days for 12 defendants, July 30th to August 1st, 1946. The speed of the proceeding communicated what kind of proceeding it was. Not an investigation, a ritual, a formal act of state violence given a courtroom setting. The verdict existed before the trial began, and everyone in the room understood this, including the men in the dock. Vlasov conducted himself as an officer. He answered questions directly. He acknowledged facts. He did not beat his chest or beg or perform the theatrical self-condemnation that Soviet courts sometimes produced from defendants. He reportedly said, at some point in the proceedings, words that have been cited by nearly everyone who has written about him since. History will judge. Whether he believed this or was saying it because it was the only thing left to say, no one can know. On the 1st of August, 1946, all 12 were hanged. Their bodies were burned, their ashes were scattered without burial, without marker, without any geographic point that could serve as a location for memory. The state was not only ending lives, it was attempting to end the possibility of commemoration, to make these people not just dead, but absent, as if they had never occupied space in the world. The absence failed. The questions did not disappear with the people who embodied them. Here is what honest examination of this story arrives at after everything that has been traced from the village of Lomakino to a rope in a Moscow courtyard. Vlasov is not a hero. This needs to be stated without qualification. A man who spent 3 years in service to a regime that was simultaneously destroying civilian populations on the territory it occupied, whose name appeared on documents used to recruit Soviet prisoners into formations that participated in operations against their own country, whose collaboration with Nazi Germany was voluntary and sustained. That man is not a hero, regardless of what he told himself about his purposes or what episode of Prague Spring he witnessed in his final weeks. The tragic circumstances of how he arrived at that position do not retroactively convert the position into something admirable. But Vlasov is also not simply a traitor, not in the flat, unambiguous, full-stop sense that Soviet propaganda employed that word as the final verdict that closed all further questions. Because closing all questions about Vlasov requires closing the questions about the system, about the 60,000 soldiers in the Volkhov swamps, about the specific people whose names appear on the orders that sent those soldiers there, and on the orders that refused to bring them back out, and on the decisions that made certain that the reports from a general documenting the deaths of his command in real time would be answered with promises that were not kept. Vlasov is a mirror, an uncomfortable one, with distortions in the glass that make it difficult to see clearly. In it is reflected simultaneously the hero of December 41 and the traitor in the German uniform and the broken man in peasant clothes in a barn. In it is reflected a war with its heroism and its crimes, its men who held and men who broke, and a system that knew with extraordinary precision how to demand absolute sacrifice from the people who served it, while reserving the right to make no corresponding guarantees. The final verdict on Vlasov cannot be rendered without rendering, at least partially, a verdict on that system as well. That is the conversation the Soviet state was not prepared to have in 1946. It is perhaps still a conversation that is not fully completed. If this investigation has given you something to think about what systems owe the people who serve them, about the line between explanation and excuse, about what a man becomes when the impossible becomes the only available condition, Leave your response in the comments. Not the verdict you think you're supposed to deliver, the one you actually arrived at. Because the genuine disagreement in those comments is itself part of how this story continues to matter. And if you want to keep following investigations that refuse to give you the comfortable version, that insist on the complete picture, even when the complete picture is more complicated than any single verdict can contain, subscribe. Because there are more stories like this one. Stories where the documents say something different from the official account, where the classified files contain the thing the state was most afraid to say out loud, where the man hanged or shot or erased from history turns out to be carrying questions that outlast the people who tried to bury them. History judges. It is still judging.